is foul and foul is fair. Hover through the fog and filthy
Hi there folks, Laurel here. It has taken me a few days to try and compose myself enough to make this video, but I thought it was important for me to make because of who it's about. I just heard on Wednesday that Wendy Babcock was found dead in her dorm at York University in Toronto on Tuesday, August 9th. She was a tireless advocate for a myriad of causes, including sex workers' rights. Wendy was also a former sex worker herself. Police have ruled out foul play, and from different sources I have heard that her death was either accidental or perhaps suicide. The exact cause may not be known for about 6 months from now. The loss for me is a personal one, but I also understand the great loss her death is to various social justice movements within Canada. Besides being passionate about sex workers' rights, she was also a strong proponent of harm reduction, worked with homeless people, drug users, and folks with mental health issues, and she also wanted to reform the child welfare system. At the time of her death, Wendy was preparing to start her 3rd year of a 4-year program to get her law degree at Osgoode Hall. There are quite a few articles about Wendy's life and passing, and I will link to a few of them in the low bar. Her vast achievements she made in her 32 years are highlighted in those articles, as well as more about her past. I want to talk about some of these things from my own time of knowing Wendy, as someone who saw these achievements and some of her past firsthand. I met Wendy, I believe, in January 1996, or perhaps very late in 1995. We were both staying in a shelter for homeless youth in Toronto, and we hit it off right away. Wendy was so open and friendly about who she was, while I was a little more closed off about myself and my past. She was one of the first people to show me that it is okay to talk about the fucked up shit that you went through. Because she was so open, I found out that we actually had quite a bit in common. We both grew up in group homes. We were both abused. We both were school dropouts. We both had done sex work, her a lot more than me. And happier shit, like we both used to ride horses and do show jumping, and were the people at the stables who would have to clean up horse shit to afford riding lessons. There were many other things as well, so needless to say we became joined at the hip quite quickly. But even if we didn't have all these things in common, just given the fact that she was funny as hell and such a warm person, I would have loved her all the same. We both hopped around the system a bit together, along with some other folks we knew until we could find affordable housing. We were both on a affordable housing waiting list. But her and I both felt that the wait was too long, and since welfare didn't pay enough, nor could jobs that we could find that we were qualified to get at the time, we both decided to get back into sex work together. We wanted to make enough so we could find a decent place to live and perhaps save enough to go back to school. I didn't really like doing sex work at this point. I felt horrible about myself, and I bought into the stigma big time. I only lasted a few months, and I ended up back in a shelter for a short time. Eventually, we both got accepted into affordable housing, and Wendy had found a fairly long-term boyfriend. Then she got engaged and pregnant. She ended up moving out of the building we were both living in to a bigger apartment. At the time, Wendy was working as an exotic dancer. She saved some money so she could have her son and got out of the sex industry. Her fiancé ended up being an abusive prick, so Wendy was left to raise her son on her own with the help of some friends. Wendy ended up going back on welfare and wanted to go back to finish school. She could not afford to raise her son just on welfare, so she ended up going back into stripping with the hopes of starting school soon. Her son was then taken in 2000, which led up to a decade-long battle to try and get her son back, which sadly she never did. Many excuses were made by the Children's Aid Society. She was a former sex worker, a former homeless person, a former drug user, someone who was in the system herself. Wendy was a teenager when she had her son, and she did the best she could with what she had. What it comes down to is if you're a poor person or a whore, you're just not a fit parent. This still fucking angers me because I was there when her son was born, and when she had him, and when she fought so hard to get him back. She absolutely loved her son, and he was her life and her heart. The injustice she faced, I think, fueled her own activism. Even with all the shit that Wendy went through, she always made the time to try and help others. She saw me through some really screwed up things. When dealing with an abusive relationship myself, I was too embarrassed to turn to anyone else, and she supported me through it. At the time, no one else knew me better than she did. When her son was taken, we were both back in sex work, herself working in dancing and myself in fetishes. Wendy also crossed over and did some work with me as well. And in 2002, we both started working together at Maggie's, the Toronto Prostitutes Community Project, as peer outreach workers. This is a time where Wendy really began to shine as an activist. She went on to work as a harm reduction worker at Street Health, where she sat on various committees, and she was also a member with quite a few of us at Sex Professionals of Canada starting in 2003. Wendy co-founded the Bad Date Coalition, which publishes a bad date book every month with details of violent crimes committed against sex workers. She also sat on an advisory committee with other sex workers to hash out a bad date line with the Toronto Police's Special Victims Unit. Wendy was there to make sure that Toronto sex workers can report crimes to police without having to fear prosecution for being sex workers. She also wanted to make sure that the cops took violent crimes against sex workers seriously. Other programs she helped create were the Safer Stroll Outreach Project, Regent Park Community Health Center's Sex Worker Drop-In, the Health Bus Sex Worker Stop, and Wendo Safety Training for Sex Workers. Wendy helped to organize many events for various causes, and she was much sought after to do public speaking and education. She was awarded with the Public Health Champion Award in 2008 by then Toronto Mayor David Miller for her dedication to sex workers and harm reduction. Wendy testified in the constitutional challenge to decriminalize sex work here in Ontario, which was something that she firmly believed in. Wendy graduated from the Women and Children's Advocacy Program at George Brown College and then got into law school with an LSAT score in the 98th percentile. Before going to post-secondary school, she only had completed grade 7. She wanted to be as effective as possible with her activism, and she believed the way that she could do that was through the legal system. Wendy was in the process of writing a book, which was to be published in time for her graduation from law school. The last note that Wendy had published on her Facebook is entitled, "Can a person be a sex workers' rights activist while not enjoying sex work themselves?" And I wanted to share it with you folks. I know that this wasn't easy for her to write, but she was brave enough to start a conversation, and I hope that perhaps it can give others in the sex workers' rights movement to think about. Please keep in mind that this is a rough draft, so I might stumble over it a bit or add in words for grammatical purposes. I have to get something off my breasts, my chest. At the risk of offending the pro-sex positive feminist movement, which I have no inclination of doing, I have to admit that as a sex workers' rights activist, and more so as a former sex worker, I have never enjoyed sex work. In fact, I am remorseful that sex work is how I lost my virginity. I regret that at 15 I entered sex work, and I despise the fact that I learned about my sexuality through sex work while the majority of other girls my age were discovering theirs in the schoolyard, usually with kids their own age. For me, sex work was something I did to survive, to get me through the years when I was homeless and too young for a full-time job, general welfare, youth shelters, and food banks. I did not engage in sex work because I wanted to express my sexuality, bring pleasure to others, or any of the other reasons pro-sex feminists have for engaging in sex work. Not that I'm condemning them for their choice or suggesting that their decision was not a well-thought-out choice to engage in sex work. I'm just saying that my reasons for being involved in sex work were different. How could I have gone into sex work for any of those aforementioned reasons without discovering my own sexuality, let alone be comfortable with it? Hell, I never even kissed another person before I headed out to my first call in Mississauga to meet a businessman who would pay me money for my virginity. I did not enjoy sex work as a teenager, nor did I enjoy it as an adult. There was always the fear of a bad client, a broken condom, and the judgment of Johns regarding my appearance, which includes having too many of them comment on my stretch marks, cellulite, and a whole slew of other insecurities that unfortunately we as women must deal with, thanks to the airbrushing of models in magazines like Vogue, Glamour, and Maxim, which would be reviewed and commented on by many Johns. I didn't enjoy the stigma, the fact that I had to hide my profession for fear of being socially isolated, teased, and worse, arrested. Had I enjoyed sex work myself, I wouldn't have quit doing sex work and taken a job that didn't require me to be sexual with the people I serviced when the opportunity presented itself. Yet I still consider myself to be a sex workers' rights activist, one that promotes the decriminalization of prostitution. And do I think that not getting pleasure from sex work diminishes or sets the sex workers' rights movement back? Hell no, in fact I believe that it enhances it. Yet our voices are not heard in the sex workers' rights movement, as it is universally and falsely believed that the current or former sex workers who dislike their previous or current occupations have no place within the sex workers' rights movement. I remember when I first got involved in sex workers' rights, and I was a naively impressionable young woman. I did a talk show for AM 680, The Bob Oakley Show. And when I mentioned that I didn't like sex work myself, I was chastised by fellow activists. They would say things such as, "How will anyone understand why decriminalization is important if you keep telling interviewers that you don't like sex work?" Or, "Don't tell people you don't like sex work. If you want to do that, you have no business speaking for sex workers' rights." Or, "You are discounting everything other sex workers' rights are saying." Stunned and not wanting to upset anyone, as I felt really passionate about the need to decriminalize sex work, I kept my mouth shut about my true feelings and instead pretended that sex work was this revolutionary way for me to reach my true sexual potential. And please don't get me wrong, it is for some sex workers. For those, sex work can be freeing, empowering, and a slap in the face to the misogynistic notion that men are the ones with the sexual power and women should just submit. However, not all of us sex workers feel this way. In fact, in my 8 years of working with street-involved sex workers, very few expressed that this is the way they felt, as many of them were survivors of violence, ripped off by clients, faced arrest, and were harassed on a regular basis. Many of them did not feel represented in the sex workers' rights movement. This is an absolute shame because if anyone should feel that they belong in the sex workers' rights movement, it's the street sex workers, because they're the ones who face the brunt of criminalization, social isolation, stigma, and discrimination. Yet when sex workers' rights are talked about, it is usually the overtly privileged sex workers, the high-end sex workers, the ones who choose sex work as a legitimate occupation over other employment choices that they could have made, who are represented. These are the sex workers who work in safer environments, the ones who work independently, who do not have to give any of their earnings over to a boyfriend or agency, the ones who work from their own or shared establishments, the ones who have the luxury of choosing where, when, and who they work with. These sex workers tend to not be the ones who see sex work as their only means of survival, who don't have to or are not aware of any other employment options. So then why, if it is street-involved sex workers who feel the harshest effects of criminalization, are not heard when it comes to the question of sex workers' rights and decriminalization? I can't answer that question, for I do not know the answer. What I do know is that we, while acknowledging my own privilege at having my voice heard in this movement as allies for the sex workers' rights movement, have an obligation to our brothers and sisters who face a much higher rate of isolation than us, must embrace sex workers that do not feel that they would stay in sex work if given the opportunity to be employed in another profession. Back to my question. Can a person be a sex workers' rights activist while not enjoying sex work themselves? I say absolutely. Just because a person does not enjoy sex work does not mean that they have nothing to add to the decriminalization debate. Since when does not liking your job mean that you can't or shouldn't speak up against the barriers that made your trade more unenjoyable, even distasteful? Personally, I believe that any debate about sex workers' rights should be more diverse than just between the people who utterly despise the profession and want it criminalized to the people that love their profession and want it decriminalized, to also include people who neither like it nor avoid it, but can justifiably see that things still need to change. There is nothing worse than hating your job and feeling like you have no voice in changing things. Or worse still, if you hate your job, the isolation, stigma, criminal records, and other legal repercussions, such as fearing losing custody of your children or the ability to retain status in your chosen country, etc., does nothing to assist those sex workers who would prefer to leave the profession. I may have disliked providing sexual services for money, but that shouldn't exclude my voice or others, that the laws that keep the sex workers working underground. Personally, I think all voices need to be heard. What do you think? Wendy left many loved ones and inspired folk behind. She really will be missed. Rest well, my sister. Till we meet again. Thanks for watching. Sláinte.